And I want to talk about another example where it seems like, Josh Riley is doing one thing, but he's actually doing another when you look at the details. You've all heard, and in fact, we talked about in the last podcast episode here, about how Josh Riley has been saying that he wants to lower utility prices, when actually a lot of his actions are going in another direction. And that is the legislation I want to talk about here. There are two bills that Josh Riley has very prominently said he is supporting, and they have a direct impact on the cost of your electric utilities. The legislation in question is, first, the Middle Mile for Rural America Act, and second, the Reconnecting Rural America Act. Now, this sounds like, Josh Riley's shtick. He likes to put on a plaid shirt, flannel, and he puts on a Carhartt jacket, and he does that like as a costume, like he's dressing up for Halloween to come talk to us folks here in upstate New York, like we're all a bunch of dairy farmers, bringing in the hay all the time. When in fact we have a very educated and diverse economy up here. No, Josh Riley likes to reduce us to a bunch of rural folks. Okay, so that's what it sounds like these bills are for. They're called the Middle Mile for Rural America Act and the Reconnecting Rural America Act. They're presented as straightforward efforts to give rural Americans better access to broadband internet service. And that sounds good, doesn't it? But there's much more to it than that. It's not just about people in the remote countryside getting up in the morning while the rooster's crowing and going out to the barn to check on the pigs. About much more than them just getting the chance to get online and check their email. Because, I'll tell you something. I come from small towns. For most of my life, I lived in towns that were 2,000 people or less that would be qualified as rural America. I have lived in a house in the middle of an alfalfa field and cornfields up in northern Cayuga County. I lived there when I was starting my online professional life, and I remember what it was like to get dial-up internet. That terrible, the data is so slow that you could hear it through the telephone line. And I wanted, rural broadband internet extension. I wanted that very badly. So I understand what it's like to live out in the countryside and want to get better internet. But let's take a look at the reality of where things stand with that today, because that was back in the early 2000s. That was in 2002, 2003, 2004, when I lived in that particular house. Today, the economic benefits of high-speed internet access for typical rural Americans are decreasing. I want to repeat that. The benefits of getting high-speed internet access for anybody in America, but also for rural Americans, is decreasing, not increasing. And that's happening because, frankly, the online economic infrastructure of the internet has been devastated by generative AI and also by what Cory Doctorow, who's from Canada, but he's written extensively on these issues, he calls enshittification. This has to do with the economic process of companies like Facebook or Meta, Google, Apple, trying to get more and more money out of the platforms that they have created, that they've made us dependent upon, to the point at which these services are no longer functioning. So if you take a look at content providers online right now, YouTube is not paying out what it used to pay out. Podcasts that do have advertisements, not like this one, are producing less money for their creators than they used to. Or look at your Google search. Google has tried to financially control your traffic by not sending you to outside sites like newspapers or university professors' scientific research or, things like that. Independent sources of information. It's replaced that with its automated generative artificial intelligence simulation of an answer at the top of its search results. And sometimes that's accurate and sometimes it's not. But what it prevents you from doing is leaving the Google universe. So the advertisements that are on Google, the revenues of those more go back to Google rather than to some other site that you would go to that has its own advertising revenue. And that means that journalists and publishers of all kinds, people who work in internet media, people who make money online, have seen a devastating reduction in their traffic this year. They're just not able to make ends meet anymore. So never has there been a time when getting broadband internet to people living out in the countryside been less economically relevant than it is today. Opportunities for remote work over the internet peaked during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, that was important back then. But you know what's happened since then? Corporations are clamping down on remote work. They are providing fewer opportunities for remote jobs. So people living out in the country who 5 years ago might have been able to get remote work through the internet, they can't do it anymore. So getting them broadband internet access, well, it's not going to do them so much good anymore. At the same time, the open web is falling apart, and it's being flooded with generative AI slop on every platform that where it's possible to publish anything. We get AI slop, images, video, text. Even on Amazon, if you are an author writing books, you now have to compete against garbage that is filling up the Amazon marketplace of books, making it more difficult for independent authors to make money. You see where this is going? Working online is less and less lucrative. It's becoming an economic sink rather than an opportunity, like what it used to be in previous decades. So we're going to get to the core of the question here and how this relates to Josh Riley. There is a question that you have to ask yourself if you are at all a critical thinker. Why is it that at the very time getting access to broadband internet is the least profitable, least economically beneficial that it ever has been? Why are Congress people like Josh Riley choosing this moment to provide government funding for legislation to lay down high-speed data lines through rural areas where very few people live? Why is that happening now? It doesn't add up. I'm going to try to work through the answer that I've been looking for to this. And it's a complex journey with a lot of stops along the way. I'm going to try to express it simply, step by step. But there is a phrase that encapsulates the answer, and it sounds really dull at first, but I want you to understand why it's important. That phrase is data centers. This story is about data centers. Oh my gosh, data centers. That sounds just boring, dull. But you should pay attention to what data centers are doing, to what they are, and who they benefit, and who they don't, who they hurt. Data centers are the technological infrastructure at the heart of the most controversial political and social issues of our time. We're talking about issues like generative artificial intelligence, fascism, your high utility bills, clean air and water, cryptocurrency, the economy, local political control, climate change, workers' rights, political corruption. It's all connected to data centers. It all runs through data centers. Because data centers, I want you to keep this in mind, data centers are technologies of power. They are literally and metaphorically conduits of power. Data centers consume massive amounts of electrical power in a literal sense, but the purpose that they do that for, in order to achieve computational power. That consumption of power is not done for its own sake. Data centers are run in order to amass economic and political power for the people who own them. And there are very few people who have that much money to own data centers. Because data centers are not just a couple of computers in a room. They are massive, massive facilities with rows upon rows and stacks upon stacks of super high-powered computers. Data centers are being built across the United States and honestly across the world in massive numbers. They're not being built primarily to support your internet experience. Going online, looking at a search engine, maybe watching a video on YouTube or TikTok. There's a little bit of data center work for that, but that's not the majority of what's going on. It's not your emails mostly. And it's not helping most businesses. The majority of what's happening with data centers now, and the new data centers that are being built primarily to help venture capitalists who are already wealthy to make even more money in two ways. Through cryptocurrency schemes, number one, and number two, through generative artificial intelligence hype. Okay, cryptocurrency and generative AI. Once again, maybe that all seems abstract to you. What is the impact of generative AI? You can talk about that and, ideas about, it's hurting people in general, but it all sounds really remote. But the fact is, it's not. The impact of generative AI and cryptocurrency in these data centers is very, very local. It's very local, especially here in New York's 19th Congressional District. And that's because just a couple of weeks before Congressman Josh Riley announced that he was supporting these two pieces of legislation, the Middle Mile for Rural America Act and the Reconnect Rural America Act, there was an announcement here in New York's 19th Congressional District that a data center is going to be built on the shores of Cayuga Lake at a place that used to burn coal, used to burn fossil fuels, that was shut down. And that was a great achievement, that we didn't have to have that dirty air going across our landscape, flowing on over to the people living in the Hudson River Valley in New York's 19th Congressional District, making our climate worse, and making the environment of Cayuga Lake worse. We succeeded in shutting that coal-fired power plant down. But now they want to open it back up as a data center. A huge new data center about to be built on the shore of Cayuga Lake. And it is owned by a company called Terawulf. And I'm going to spell that for you so that you can search for it. And I want you to go to the website of Ithaca Voice, because they have really one of the only articles about this, investigating this so far. It's not a complete article. It doesn't go into all the nooks and crannies, but it does a pretty darn good job of introducing you to it. So you want to spell this Terawulf, Terawulf. That's a company called Terawulf. So that announcement was made on August 14th, this year, 2025. The announcement said that Terawulf had obtained an 80-year lease to operate this former coal-fired electrical power plant that sits just a few feet, it's really quite close, to the waters of Cayuga Lake in the northern part of the town of Lansing, which is in New York's 19th Congressional District. It's in Josh Riley's territory. Shortly after this, within a couple of days, really, it was announced that Terawulf had just gained a $1.4 billion investment from Google in order to support its debt financing, which would make the construction at the Cayuga Lake facility and other data centers like it possible. Well, now that sounds pretty great for Terawulf. This must be some great company, right? Yeah, that was the intent of the announcement, to give that impression. Make it sound like both Google and Terawulf had a great financial gain. But if you take a look at what's underneath that, it's all kind of an illusion, or you might say part of an economic bubble, which is what a lot of very serious economic analysts at very serious publications like Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal are warning us about, that data centers are part of an economic bubble, and that when it bursts, there's going to be trouble for people working in the rest of America, in the places where these data centers are built. So here's what makes this kind of all just a fancy economic shell game. There's this 80-year lease, right? Wow, that sounds like a big commitment. Sounds like this must be a substantial company with a lot of plans if they're thinking 80 years ahead of time. My gosh. But in fact, Terawulf got that lease from a sister company called Riesling Power, LLC. Riesling Power, LLC has owned that former coal-fired power plant on the shore of Cayuga Lake for years. In fact, Riesling ran it as a coal-fired power plant. Riesling was burning coal at that place. And that tells you about their lack of environmental commitment, ecological sustainability. But the thing is that Riesling Power, LLC, has the very same CEO and majority owner as Terawulf does. That's a man named Paul Prager, Prager. So essentially, Paul Prager approved the lease to Terawulf from another one of his companies. He's dealing with himself. He didn't make some kind of excellent deal. He just said, I'm going to allow myself to do this thing with a thing that I already own. There already was access and availability. And in fact, Paul Prager has been talking about developing the Cayuga power plant location for many years and has lots of ideas about how to do that. And you're going to hear a lot of ideas put out, but I want you to keep this in mind. There is not a single specific plan that has been presented by Terawulf for what they're going to do with that Cayuga power plant. There are some suggestions. There's been a press release. They have talked to some local officials off the record, but they have not made a concrete binding plan. And that in itself ought to concern you, because Terawulf and Riesling Power and Paul Prager have a history of saying that they're going to do one thing and then doing something quite different. So what they all get out of this in the short term is a massive increase in stock price. This is for both Terawulf and for Google. They announced this impressive sounding 80-year lease and Google's investment, and all of a sudden, the stock price of both Google and Terawulf went way, way up. And Paul Prager made a lot of money just from that, creating the appearance of a major advancement for Google as an investor in Terawulf and for Terawulf itself. Corporate chicanery, dishonesty, snake oil is standard operating procedure for Terawulf and for Paul Prager. Terawulf is a financially unstable company. It's documented. It's been spending money at an unusually rapid pace without an immediately plausible path to profit. And I'm not the only one saying this. Terawulf is making a big gamble with this Cayuga power plant. Billions of dollars in investment in the hope that cryptocurrency and generative AI will become legitimate means of profit in our economy. And by the way, Donald Trump and his fascist government are betting on exactly the same thing. But at present, cryptocurrency is not a legitimate tool for economic income. And generative AI is not either. A recent study by MIT found that of the business enterprises that it surveyed, 95% of them had not made back a single dollar of their investment in generative AI tools. Generative AI, it has been documented in other research, provides the impression of productivity without actually creating economic productivity. That in fact, workers who use generative AI tools believe that they are being more productive when an objective analysis of their work shows that their work is actually slowed down by this technology. And a lot of corporations that have been pushing the hype of generative AI using the equivalents of ChatGPT, they're beginning to wise up. And as that happens, the massive amounts of investment that have been taking place into generative AI may soon evaporate. And all of that investment ends up being for not very much at all. That's a lot of money lost. It's a lot of economic damage. Cryptocurrency has been around for a very long time and has never proven to be economically beneficial, except in one thing, allowing Donald Trump to take over $1 billion of bribes so far, just since he's become president of the United States. Cryptocurrency is an excellent means of the bribery of members of Congress and of the President of the United States and of members of his cabinet. So, I want to get specific when it comes to Terawulf. Terawulf has two ways of making money at data centers right now. And the first is through Bitcoin mining. The second is through supporting generative AI. Because generative AI, if you just work with ChatGPT, it makes it look like it's just a thing that's happening on the web. But the web exists in places. And generative AI, even a simple question going into ChatGPT, requires a lot of computing power to execute. To create the model requires a lot of computing power, and that's a lot of electricity. A lot of computers, supercomputers, running at high speeds using a ton, not literally a ton, megatons, massive amounts of electricity, okay? Grizzly Research looked into Terawulf, because Terawulf has been, making a lot of money talking about Bitcoin, about cryptocurrency, about generative AI. It's been surfing the hype. But what is the economic stability of Terawulf itself? Grizzly Research analysts issued a report, I think it was last year, in which they referred to Terawulf as, quote, a charade, unquote. Here's another phrase that they used to describe Terawulf, quote, a house of cards used by insiders to enrich themselves, unquote. This report from Grizzly Research also says, quote, the CEO, Paul Prager, and his friends are using previously failed business assets from Beowulf, another one of Paul Prager's companies, to siphon as much money out of the public company as possible, unquote. So there are a huge number of shell companies that are owned by Paul Prager. Terawulf is one of. Beowulf is another one. Riesling Power is yet another one. But what this report analyzing the actual economics, the finance of Terawulf, of Paul Prager's business empire, said this, quote, Terawulf has missed its original projections by ridiculous margins, missing estimates by 79% and 91%, unquote. And that the management team, the report said, has, quote, a history of large business failures and a history of overpromising and underdelivering, unquote. And now they want to make this company, they want to make a data center on the shores of our lake with this kind of reputation. And seeing that the very deal to create the Cayuga Lake data center in the town of Lansing itself has been promoted with dishonesty, with deception. The Cayuga Lake lease that Paul Prager has given himself through the Terawulf company, it gives him control over 183 acres of ecologically sensitive land that is on the shore of Cayuga Lake, and it grants Terawulf the right to install massive racks of energy-hungry computers that will consume 400 megawatts of electricity 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. I want to repeat that Terawulf has yet to submit any specific plans for the data center on Cayuga Lake. There are no diagrams. There is no business model specifically. So far, it's all talk and a lot of proposals and suggestions that it's going one way or another, but no binding commitment. And remember what Grizzly Research said, that the management team at Terawulf has, quote, a history of large business failures and a history of overpromising and under-delivering. So some reports are saying that Terawulf has promised not to burn fossil fuels at the site of the Cayuga power plant. But we know that in the past, Paul Prager's own company burned coal there. There are some reports saying that they're committing not to using this for cryptocurrency mining. But at other times, Paul Prager's companies have actually stated that they refuse to commit to avoid cryptocurrency mining. They say one thing and then they say another thing. they do one thing after they have said another thing. They routinely break their promises. So we don't know specifically how this is going to turn out, but this much is clear. The Terawulf Cayuga Lake data center will mostly be run by burning dirty fossil fuels. And it's just a matter of where those fossil fuels are going to be burned. Are they going to be burned on site or remotely? That's the only matter of contention here, because this whole system that we're working in remains dependent mostly on fossil fuels for our electrical grid upstate. And even if they're not burning coal, they're going to be burning methane. And that is a substance that is 200 times more destructive to the global climate than carbon dioxide is, even if it's not being burned. Just if it escapes through leaks, which it does, through transportation, through equipment failure. So there's this press release from Terawulf that celebrates a plan to build a solar farm on the property, that was those 183 acres. But what the press release doesn't say is that that solar farm is actually not going to be built by Paul Prager's companies. It's going to be built by another company. And the electricity generated by that solar farm is not going to go to the Cayuga Lake data center. It is planned, according to Terawulf itself, that the energy from that power plant is going to go into the NYSEG electrical grid. So that's kind of just a red herring to make the whole thing look like it's ecologically sensitive, when in fact it has nothing to do with the running of the data center at all. I mean, unless they change their minds again, unless they turn their business plan around. And with Terawulf, it's always impossible to say what's going to be going on. And yet Terawulf, in its press release, says that the energy for the Cayuga Lake data center is going to be, quote, predominantly zero carbon. Boy, that sounds really good. It sounds like there's no consequence for this. It's all going to be green power, so no one gets hurt. People make a lot of money, and it's really just a great green future for us all. Only we know with Terawulf that that's not how things actually work. And other independent investigations have found that Terawulf and other companies run by Paul Prager routinely engage in greenwashing, which means that they say that they're doing environmentally friendly energy work, but that actually what they do in practice is the opposite. Their words do not match their deeds. Terawulf and Paul Prager cannot be trusted. What they're saying in the proposals that you're going to see referred to, which are merely verbal proposals at this point, in the Ithaca Voice article, is the idea that the new Cayuga Lake data center that Terawulf will build and maintain will take all of its energy from the NYSEG electrical grid, taking all that energy from what NYSEG is currently producing. Now, a couple of things are worth thinking about there. I want you to think about that economically in terms of your utility bills and what that's going to mean. But let's think about this environmentally. Terawulf says that almost all of the electrical energy created in New York State is zero carbon. It's clean energy. But this electricity is not going to be taken from New York State more broadly. It's going to be taken specifically from NYSEG. And with NYSEG, most of the electricity is still produced through the burning of fossil fuels. So if it's taking its power from NYSEG and that electrical system, it's not going to be predominantly zero carbon. That just doesn't add up. They can say that it's true, but it's not. And they've been actually caught doing this at another one of their facilities in upstate New York. There is a data center right now on the shores of Lake Ontario between Rochester and Buffalo. If you take the highway out that runs along Lake Ontario, you may have seen in the past this place where great big long trains full of coal cars just pumping the coal to be burned into this giant facility. Well, that's now no longer burning coal, which is great, but it's become a data center. That data center is taking a huge amount of electricity out of New York State's, out of our electrical grid, and it's causing economic problem for people in terms of their utility bills. When they proposed doing that work at what they call this facility is Lake Mariner, at that Lake Mariner facility, Terawulf said in its promotional materials that it was going to be a clean, green plant because upstate New York has clean, green energy, saying that it was almost all completely zero carbon. But that just isn't true. The majority of NYSEG electricity comes from burning fossil fuels, which makes our air dirty and it increases climate change. We can't go completely zero carbon yet in our society. We are trying. There are a lot of people trying. In fact, we would have, our society, American society, would have significantly reduced its carbon output, its carbon dioxide pollution over the last 3 years if it was not for the building of data centers across the United States of America. Because you know something? Clean energy works. Wind energy, solar energy. These are actually more economical, cheaper sources of energy, and they're sustainable and they don't pollute the environment. They work. And we have made great technical and social advances in the use of that energy. But Silicon Valley and its get-rich-quick schemes through cryptocurrency, through generative AI, have created a sudden demand for the construction of gigantic data centers, and that has more than made up for the advances that we've made in our society with clean energy. So, actually, our carbon emissions have gone up when they should have been going down, and we are at a critical point in history where we have the chance, if we actually get our carbon emissions down, we can reduce the negative impacts of climate change. But that time is quickly coming to an end. And it is largely because of data centers, like what Terawulf is building on the shore of Cayuga Lake, because of the dishonesty with which they're claiming to be green, environmentally sustainable, and they're just not. But why are you burning those fossil fuels? They're burning it. They're polluting our skies. They're accelerating climate change for the sake of cryptocurrency, for the sake of generative AI, so that somebody can make a stupid video using tools like Sora, or they can make a song to get money, a little bit of money out of the Spotify system, and making it harder for actual musicians to make a living, to replace the work of human artists, of human writers, with generative AI. To do that, to wreck our society, to make economic opportunity harder for ordinary working people, so that a few people can make a really big profit with generative AI. And the same thing with cryptocurrency. It's contributing to fascism through the bribery, the massive enrichment of politicians who are now willing to vote for and to do terrible, terrible things because people are willing to bribe them to do it using cryptocurrency, and nobody is standing up to that. That's what these data centers are for. It's not to make your life better, my life better. It's not to improve society. It's to make money through the rapid wrecking of our society and the reduction of our economic opportunity. Shady digital get-rich-quick schemes. Data centers are both literally and figuratively linked to the nation's power grid. Data centers are at the heart of this technological transformation and an ideological struggle that is bringing the American economy to the edge of catastrophe and bringing the politics of the United States of America to the brink of total authoritarianism. If there is a social issue that you care about, the chances are pretty good it's linked to the rapid construction of data centers across our country. And that makes the Terawulf data center on Cayuga Lake, I think, a pretty potent symbol for the political struggles of our times, as we can see them in our own congressional district here in upstate New York. So, let's take a look at cryptocurrency. Bitcoin mining, for example, which is what made Terawulf a company in the first place. It has nothing to do with digging for ore. The use of mining in cryptocurrency is just a term that's a metaphor for mathematical problem. huge systems of supercomputers doing mathematical problems that have no practical benefit to anybody, except to engage in a kind of online gambling where owners of these Bitcoin mines are hoping to get a piece of Bitcoin and then to be able to hold it and to sell it, to make money by doing computing work that helps nobody at all. Of course, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies do have one proven case use, which is the bribery of the President of the United States, members of Congress, administrators in our federal government, taking bribes. Nobody standing in the way. Terawulf, and through its subsidiary Beowulf, has in the past refused to rule out using the Cayuga Lake data center to engage in Bitcoin mining. And that's having an impact, in turn, on our political system, as we have our own government engaging in the practice of massive disinformation, and a lot of it being repeated and promoted through what they call AI slop. As Americans use generative AI more and more, they become less capable of critical examination of that. So data centers are a technology of fascism. Data centers are also a significant factor in the rapid increase of utility bills. And I want you to listen to somebody else talk about this, because a colleague of Josh Riley in Congress, Democratic Congressman Suhas Subramaniam, warned his colleagues about the negative impact of data centers in Virginia. It's his district that has the highest concentration of data centers of any congressional district in the nation. And here's what he had to say about that.
Data storage is more important than ever as we have AI and blockchain becoming more prevalent and accessible. But I want to tell you a cautionary tale about my community. My district is home to more data centers than any other district in the country. In fact, if my district were a country, it'd have more data centers than almost every other country in the world. And if you look at this, 10 data centers usually use more power than all of DC. And we have more than 200. And with another 100 planned. And many years ago, when these data centers were approved, they seemed like a great idea at the time. Talk about lower property taxes and revenue for the counties, but our community is paying the price now, and we're a cautionary tale for the rest of the country. The power needed for these data centers is creating a huge problem for a community. We have power lines right now in Ashburn and Leesburg and all over Loudoun County. Leesburg, Lovettsville, Fauquier, Rappahannock counties are facing similar proposals of building transmission lines or data centers that are, quite frankly, invasive and not great for the communities. And we are paying the price now for many of these data centers. And in the next 5 years alone, data centers could increase customers' bills by up to $276 a year, and people's utility bills may double in the next 7 to 10 years just to power data centers. And the environmental impact is real as well. These green spaces are disappearing, pollution is rising, and water supplies are being stretched thin. It's making reaching our clean energy goals in Virginia nearly impossible. We set those in place. And even historic places like Manassas Battlefield are under threat as well.
What ends up happening economically is that when you have a data center built, you have to put down not just power lines, which are already there, to be fair, for the Cayuga Lake facility, but you'll have to put down broadband internet access lines, fiber optics, for example, or even more high-speed kinds of technologies to connect those data centers to networks that actually power and make the internet possible. You have to get the data to move, but who ends up paying for that? Often it's people who are paying higher bills to local utility companies. And what happens then if the data center fails? Well, that price does not go away. The price of that infrastructure still needs to be paid, and it ends up being paid by the members of utilities like NYSEG. Households like yours will see your utility prices go up, even if the Terawulf data center is not built. And like I said before, Terawulf has a history of issuing false statements not just about its business in general, but also about specifically the sources of energy that it's going to use. An investigation of Terawulf by Hunter Brook concluded this, quote, Terawulf's claims of using excess renewable energy that would otherwise go to waste are also contradicted by state energy officials and experts who say that there is no surplus renewable power in New York, with Bitcoin mining increasing consumption of oil and gas. So Terawulf's claims of using excess renewable energy that would go to waste, that's not accurate. It's simply not happening. With climate change, I've talked about this as well. But the grisly research of Terawulf observes this, that Terawulf, quote, portrays itself as an environmentally sustainable company, but that cannot be further from reality, unquote. What about clean air and water? Terawulf Communications suggests that one possible plan for running its Cayuga data center involves pumping massive amounts of water. We're talking millions of gallons daily from Cayuga Lake to cool its banks of high-powered computers. And then, well, one possibility is that it just dumps that water right back into Cayuga Lake. And that's happened at other data centers. In fact, Terawulf, in its documents so far, celebrates specifically, quote, the industrial scale water intake system, unquote, that's already present at Cayuga Lake, at that site. That's part of its, quote, critical components for supporting enterprise-scale computing workloads, unquote. Terawulf is saying right here, bringing in water from Cayuga Lake in massive amounts to cool its computers is part of its plans. And there are really concrete consequences for our lake and for the people who live around our lake from that. One of the consequences is the growth of harmful algal blooms. Now, this is already a problem because of irresponsible use of fertilizers around Cayuga Lake and because of climate change, warming up the temperature of Cayuga Lake. Harmful algal blooms. If you don't live around here and you don't follow the news about this, it can seem like some kind of weird subject. But it's really important because it has to do with the health of people who are enjoying or living close to Cayuga Lake. These algal blooms contain neurotoxins. This algae is growing in the water in the summertime, in the late springtime, and into the autumn quite often. And it's generating neurotoxins, which means substances that interfere with the proper use of the nerves in your body. And specifically, that's pretty important for human beings in our brains and in the use of our muscles. If you have a lot of neurotoxins in your body, you can get very sick, or you can actually die. And harmful algal blooms are documented to take place with an increase in water temperature because they just reproduce at a faster rate. It speeds up their metabolism. What's more, scientific research shows that neurotoxins from harmful algal blooms can sicken people who are not even in the water. You don't have to be swimming in Cayuga Lake. You can just be standing on the shore or living in a place that is downwind from Cayuga Lake, because the wind, as it whips across Cayuga Lake, as it often does, aerosolizes, meaning it takes these particles from the neurotoxins, from the water that have been growing in the harmful algal blooms, and it gets them going up into the air in small particles that then can be breathed in by people on the shore, people living nearby. A neurotoxin. This is pretty serious stuff. So one model of cooling the supercomputers that are helping out with cryptocurrency and generative AI is to produce neurotoxins. I think that everyone can agree that's a pretty bad idea. An alternative method exists, though, and that's the use of massive evaporation tanks to cool down the millions of gallons of water pumped through the center on Cayuga Lake. Millions of gallons of water evaporating on the shore of Cayuga Lake has an impact on our local weather patterns through the release of massive amounts of moisture and, heat. This is basic physics. Heat does not disappear when you have hot water evaporating. It doesn't just go nowhere. There are environmental impacts from that. You don't destroy energy, you're just changing the form of it. Besides, this process takes a huge amount of energy, which requires the burning of even more fossil fuels, which accelerates climate change, which in turn increases the temperature of our lake water. So there we go right back to the neurotoxins coming from the harmful algal blooms all over again, plus all of the other terrible consequences that we're already beginning to experience. This year, we've had extreme temperatures, and we have swung from floods all the way into drought, and who knows what comes next. There is yet another alternative, to be fair, and this is used at Lake Mariner on Lake Ontario, which is owned by Terawulf. And that's the use of industrial fans to cool the supercomputers, because those supercomputers, they work so hard they get really hot. And up there at Lake Mariner, they use fans that are blowing night and day, every day of the week, every week of the year. There are public records from town meetings up there in which residents are reporting that they can't sleep, they can't get any peace. And there's one resident who talks about that she lives even 2 miles away from this plant, and she never gets peace. She always can hear this data center and its industrial fans blowing all the time. Imagine that on Cayuga Lake, because Cayuga Lake itself is a little bit less than 2 miles across, which means the far shore is going to be hearing it, which means that 2 miles to the north, 2 miles to the south, if you have these industrial fans going, that's what you're going to be hearing all the time. Industrial machinery, night and day, all year long. We've talked about cryptocurrency. And Terawulf's own documents include references to, quote, the ability to mine Bitcoin profitably, and the phrase Bitcoin mining as part of the planned operations, not from a previous plan, but for the most recent plans, its own recent statements. So on the one hand, it's saying, no, we're not going to do Bitcoin mining, but then it refers to Bitcoin mining in its own documents. And, we have here, if you want to understand cryptocurrency, here at Josh Riley Watch, we've had several episodes on it and how it's connected to the core problems that we're having in our society today, the growth of fascism and the growth of massive amounts of political corruption in our country. I have absolutely no evidence that Josh Riley is taking any cryptocurrency bribes himself, but the cryptocurrency industry has become extremely powerful. And so Josh Riley has voted repeatedly to deregulate that industry, to take away the regulations that were created under Joe Biden, under the Democrats. Josh Riley, like he often does, is actually voting against his own political party, against the Democrats. He's voting with Donald Trump, with the Republicans, to allow more cryptocurrency corruption to take place. And I encourage you to listen to some of those other episodes, past episodes of Josh Riley Watch. But I want to bring it back to Josh Riley here, because this is ultimately about our own member of Congress. There are these two bills I want to remind you of, the Reconnecting Rural America Act and the Middle Mile for Rural America Act. Both of these pieces of legislation are designed to create broadband internet infrastructure across rural America. And these bills are not written by Josh Riley. They were written by industry lobbyists, and they were introduced by Republicans. Republican U.S. Representative Zachary Nunn, U.S. Representative, a Republican, Randy Feenstra. Josh Riley's just tagging along. with the lobbyists and the Republicans on this one. And Randy Feenstra, as a member of Congress, has particularly strong ties to the data center industry. Here's the thing I want you to understand. These two bills that Josh Riley is supporting in Congress, they are for data centers, not for rural New Yorkers. They have that word rural in them, and so you think that they're for country folks and ordinary people to get their high-speed internet. But I want to look at the facts related to that. There's this source of news for digital technology related to that industry. It's called Fast Mode. They had a really interesting report about this issue, about middle mile legislation. You may remember that's a phrase that's in one of these pieces of legislation that Josh Riley is supporting. Middle mile for rural America. What is the idea of the middle mile? It's the idea that there are cities on the one hand, and then there are these very remote locations in rural places, okay? And you can have that data center out in rural areas. But then you have the cities where, you have companies, you have your technology centers that are actually going to make use of what that data center is doing. But the middle mile is the place in between. And if you don't have a high-speed connection there, well, it doesn't work. You can't have rural data centers unless all the way through, going through the countryside, through the rural landscape. You can't have the people in the cities, like, say, Silicon Valley and San Francisco. They can't profit from what's being done in the countryside. You have to have high-speed lines all the way through. That's what middle mile is really all about. And Fast Mode reported on how that's connected to data centers. So it's promoted as if it's giving access to residents of rural areas, like ma and pa on the farm. But actually, it's ultimately designed to provide government funding for the creation of data centers in rural America. Here's what that report said. Quote, further data center growth in the area and many urban areas is stifled due to lack of large parcels of land and the lack of local power generation. Bloomberg reported in 2024 that there was a 7-year wait for data center power hookup in Virginia. However, as we improve data center interconnect infrastructure, we will rely less on the need for geographic proximity and consider proximity as it relates to time or latency. The current space and power challenges of urban data center operations present an opportunity for data center expansion in rural areas. The operational advantages of deploying data centers in rural areas are compelling. Ideal data center sites often need to accommodate over 1 million square feet of space and hundreds of megawatts of power to meet the needs of hyperscale customers. These specific criteria can be met by many rural areas, and this means rural broadband transport networks could act not only as aggregation networks, but also as data center and middle mile interconnect. There's that phrase, middle mile, also in the legislation that Josh Riley is promoting. Here's what middle mile really means. It means that the centers of importance are at the data center itself, at that facility, and then very far away in places like Manhattan, in places like Austin, Texas, in places like San Francisco, Seattle. You get the idea. Big cities, places with a lot of money and big digital corporations, and then the data centers that they own. And then the rest of us, we're just in the middle. We're just in the way. This is not being created for ordinary internet customers. Look at the phrase that's here from this Fast Mode report. It's for, quote, hyperscale customers. This infrastructure is being created for the most powerful corporations that have ever existed, the most wealthy individuals, venture capitalists, and executives at these corporations who have ever existed. It's not being made for ma and pa on the farm. Here's another article, and this one is actually written by an industry insider, Bill Long, who is an executive at a telecommunications company called Zayo, Z-A-Y-O. And here's what Bill Long has to say about this. Quote, "We're seeing additional interest in rural communities from hyperscalers." Now, well, hold on. Let me just stop that right there. Do you know any hyperscalers? Do you know any hyperscalers here in New York's 19th Congressional District? No, you do not. This is not about people in our district. This is about people at these hyperscalers, which are these big generative AI companies and big cryptocurrency scammers. People who are scamming people and making money off of political corruption, and who are flooding the internet with generative AI slop for profit. That's what this is about. The hyperscalers, not you. Okay. Bill Long says, "We are seeing additional interest in rural communities from hyperscalers, the Googles and Amazons of the world, responsible for ushering in the first wave of AI. Why? Because AI workloads require a massive amount of data, and hyperscalers need somewhere to put it. Hyperscalers are investing millions in data center campuses to house this data, but the space and power requirements for these campuses are pushing them out of the large metropolitan areas and into more rural locations, where space and power are plenty and cheap. But these data centers also need high-speed internet, and lots of it. So what does this mean? Middle mile infrastructure will be the next frontier. By investing in the middle mile infrastructure, we can drive faster deployment of AI. AI has the potential to transform our digital economy at an order of magnitude, reminiscent of the cloud in the early days of the internet itself, but these transformations require infrastructure that is robust and sophisticated enough to support, and that infrastructure isn't built overnight. By prioritizing investment in the middle mile backbone, we are providing this critical runway to accelerate the deployment of AI and ensure that we have ample infrastructure in place to allow this technology to scale. And who is this technology going to scale for? Scale in profit? It's not going to be for you. It's going to be for the hyperscalers. Bill Long's own words here, the Googles and Amazons of the world. That's what this legislation that Josh Riley is supporting is really all about. It's about getting the rich to get even richer. And ironically, this same technology is wrecking ordinary Americans' ability to make money online, to actually live in the rural places where they want to live. Instead, we're just seen as, it's not even flyover country anymore. It's middle mile country. And that's where you put all the data centers, because that's where the land is cheap. And that's where you can bulldoze over the local governments. You know, at this beginning of this episode, I asked a question. Why are members of Congress like Josh Riley all of a sudden focusing on laying down high-speed data lines through rural areas where few people live at a time when the availability of online work is decreasing and when the traditional internet used by most Americans is falling apart under the onslaught of generative AI? These reports that I just read from provide us with the foundation of a pretty good explanation, I think. The Reconnecting Rural America Act and the Middle Mile for Rural America Act are designed to encourage data centers, to profit data centers owned by venture capitalists who live in luxurious homes in faraway cities in other parts of the country under the pretext of providing internet access to plain old country folks. You know, like how Josh Riley dresses up in his flannel and his Carhartt jacket. They pretend that's what it's for. But is that Josh Riley's real customer here? Now, Josh Riley, by supporting this legislation, is supporting the Googles and Amazons of the world. And that's not making life better here in New York's 19th Congressional District. Why should the government pay for it? Think about that. Because the legislation that Josh Riley is introducing, or is co-sponsoring, asks the federal government to foot the bill. Do you think that Google, Amazon, these big cryptocurrency miners, do you think that they lack the money to lay these lines? They have plenty of money. They have trillions of dollars to throw around. But this legislation asks the American people, the federal government, the public, to pay the bill so that those digital corporations can make even more of a profit while trashing our lake, trashing Cayuga Lake. And we have to pay for the privilege. You know, I can anticipate some people arguing that the construction of networks of extremely fast data transmission technology through the countryside of New York's 19th Congressional District is really just a conceptual extension of the rural electrification of the 1930s. And who could stand against that, right? Well, one problem with that analogy is that the population of the United States is actually much less rural now than it was in the 1930s, when that initial rural electrification took place. In the 1930s, 50% of Americans lived in rural settings, and now only 20% of Americans do. So you're actually serving fewer people with this. Now, I want to repeat, I grew up in small towns. I lived in the countryside for most of my life. Right now I'm living in Ithaca because that's where I have to be. But most of my life I've lived in rural America. So I'm not putting down what rural Americans need, but what do they actually need? Let's talk about that. Because another problem with the rural electrification analogy is that the technology that is going to be installed with these bills that Josh Riley is supporting across rural America, it's not at all like the electric lines that were installed into the countryside, into small towns, in rural areas in the 1930s. It's not like that at all. It's more like installing industrial-grade lines of high transmission energy towers. Rural electrification that was supported by government loans, we'll get to that in a minute, that was about enabling households to have enough electricity to have a light bulb or two and to run a refrigerator so you could keep your food fresh. That was it. It wasn't about having high-powered electrical lines going to every house, and it wasn't about building factories where there used to be farms. The people who will benefit from the legislation supported by Josh Riley are going to be the wealthy owners and investors in digital technology corporations, not simple country folks who have never been on the internet before. People living in most parts of rural America already have access to the internet, and the vast majority of rural Americans, the vast majority, have broadband internet access already. And here I am citing a recent report, the most recent report by the Federal Communications Commission. According to that most recent report from the FCC, only 22.3% of rural Americans, and remember there aren't that many rural Americans left anymore, only 22.3% of rural Americans lacked high-speed internet access at the time of that report, and that report is 5 years old, describing only data from before 2018. That's 7 years ago. And in the meantime, broadband internet access in rural areas has been improving steadily year by year. According to the FDA, only 14% of rural American households lacked high-speed internet access as of 2 years ago. The Food and Drug Administration, they cover rural areas because of the agriculture. That's 2 years ago, 14%. You see how much that number is diminishing? Only 14% of rural Americans lacked high-speed internet access. Here's a quote from that report. The gap between urban and rural or tribal areas has narrowed each year, unquote. That FCC report showed that between the years of 2014 and 2018, this is the original report that I referred to, rural broadband internet access expanded at an average annual rate of 4.35%. And if that rate held true over the last 7 years, every single rural American would have broadband internet access right now. And of course, that rate has probably not held steady. And there's a reason for that, which is that the very few people in rural America, the very few people who still don't have access to high-speed internet are for the most part really far out in the countryside, far away from modern infrastructure in general, and typically they don't even have municipal water access. Okay? That's why the benefit from continued federal funding of expansion of broadband internet access to rural households, that justification makes less and less sense every year. And there's another difference between rural expansion of broadband internet and the rural electrification program of the 1930s. In the 1930s, the federal government wasn't giving away the money. That rural electrification took place through federal loans to cooperative networks. Loans. That money was paid back to the American people, to the federal government. But now, the Middle Mile for Rural America Act that Josh Riley is supporting, the Reconnecting Rural America Act of 2025, they don't just provide loans, they provide outright gifts of federal government money to pay for the infrastructure that's going to benefit the big digital corporations and cryptocurrency scammers. Why should the federal government pay to help these rich and powerful people get even more rich? It isn't for the people living in the countryside. Most of the people in the countryside have not only internet access, not only broadband internet access, they have hard line, like, we're talking cables, okay, for broadband access to their homes. The huge majority of rural America already does, and the rest of them are living out in extreme distances from infrastructure, not like what we have here in New York's 19th Congressional District. If the legislation that Josh Riley has endorsed, these two bills, if that passes into law, the American people are going to be paying to set up digital infrastructure to benefit wealthy investors, and we're never going to get paid back because it's not going to be a loan, it's going to be a grant to the rich, to the powerful. Crypto bros and generative AI scammers spreading slop all over the place are going to profit from government assistance under these bills, at the same time that our schools, our hospitals, our disaster assistance, they're enduring harsh federal budget cuts. But Josh Riley wants to take money and go spend it on big, powerful, wealthy digital corporations. So the real needs of rural Americans for good education, good health care, that's being done away with, while people who already have more than they could ever spend in an entire lifetime are going to make more of a profit. And I'm not okay with that. These bills appear to be about just helping rural folks, but they're not. And what bothers me as much about that as the fact that it's going to be helping the powerful and wealthy to make more money, to become even more powerful and more wealthy in a time when concentration of power in America is the number one issue we're dealing with. It's underneath every problem that we have. It's why our democracy is falling apart. What really bothers me is that Josh Riley isn't being honest about it. He goes out there and he talks about, those foreigners who are invested in NYSEG, they're the problem. It's the foreigners that are causing your utility bills to go so high. The foreigners are to blame, says Josh Riley, while he's supporting legislation that's going to increase your NYSEG bill significantly and do it for the sake of people at the biggest, most powerful corporations the world has ever seen. Executives at Google, at Meta, at Amazon, venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, like Peter Thiel, who are out there promoting their weird transhumanist ideas that their technology is going to replace humanity and that will be a good thing. This isn't about helping rural folks. So please, Josh Riley, don't come out here dressed in your Carhartts and in your flannel shirts, because people are really struggling here. And most of all, what we need is the understanding that we have a representative in Congress who is going to be straight with us, who isn't going to try to blame foreigners for problems created by digital corporations like Google and Terawulf. And we're looking right here on Cayuga Lake at a physical manifestation of this problem. Now, I want all of you to guess, has Josh Riley had anything to say about the Terawulf data center on Cayuga Lake? I can't find a damn word that he's had to say about that. putting data centers above people, that's just the cherry on top of the cake for me. And as I said, because the economy is falling apart, I'm having to take a side hustle on top of my side hustle, on top of my main work. I'm struggling just to make ends meet. It's a lot to deal with, so I'm going to have to take a little bit of a break from Josh Riley Watch while I put my focus and my attention elsewhere. But I don't want you to make the mistake that just because I'm not talking about it doesn't mean we don't have things to talk about. We have these insane bills that Josh Riley is voting for, blaming kids in Washington, D.C., using them as justification for the militarization of our cities, celebrating the biblical truth of Charlie Kirk, who said that black women aren't smart enough to get jobs that really belong just to white people. Last year, a year ago, I was out there week after week, walking door to door in the heat, going up the hills, down the hills, till my feet were sore, canvassing for Josh Riley. Because I wanted to have a representative who would do better than Mark Molinaro. And let's not forget, the Republicans are not going to come to our rescue with these things. They're going to do the same damn thing. But we voted for Josh Riley. We volunteered for Josh Riley. We donated to Josh Riley because he was supposed to stand up to this garbage. And instead, he's just another politician who's shoveling it out.